Don't forget that the next primary source essay is due a week from tomorrow, and then 3 weeks from today is the next exam. And so a lot of things coming up here as we get into October. There are a few things I wanted to finish up related to doctrine, and we were specifically talking about the issue of canon, talking about the different ways that canon was approached, especially in the 4th century, finishing up with how Eusebius had those different categories of what books were recognized, what books were disputed, what books were spurious, and what books were heretical.
How does that go with modern canon? Are there books of the Bible that are thought of as possibly incorrect in a modern basis, or is that very rare?
Now, in thinking about the canon, for a lot of people, the canon is closed in the 4th century. It's reopened a little bit by Luther in the Reformation, in that he has some problems with the book of James and the book of Hebrews, especially, because it seems like those are emphasizing works too much for Luther. The only place where there is substantial difference today has to do with what books should be included in the Christian Old Testament. Right, Protestants have 39 books that were originally in Hebrew, but Catholics, Anglican, Orthodox have additional books in the Old Testament. Books like the book of Maccabees, the book of Tobit, Judith. They differ among themselves as to how many of those are to be included and what's to be included. So that's basically where any sort of difference would be today, is over the Old Testament, not so much the New Testament. And thinking about how individuals approach this issue of what books are the scriptures, there were a couple of things that appeared to be the case, or a couple of criteria that appear to have been used by people. There's not a list anywhere that said we're using these criteria, but as you look through the writings of early Christians, there were things that they emphasized as to why certain books were accepted and why certain books were not. One, of course, was the issue of inspiration. Was this book believed to be inspired by God? Were there claims about inspiration? And so if it's not believed to be an inspired book, then certainly it doesn't belong as Scripture. And so one book that a lot of people felt useful was First Clement, written by a bishop of Rome in the latter part of the 1st century to the city of Corinth. It had a lot of good guidance, but Clement never claimed, and no one else seems to have claimed, that it was a work of inspiration. It was a work based on just this Christian leaders reading of Scripture, knowledge of tradition, etc. So there were works like that which were considered useful, but were not believed to be inspired. Another criteria that seems to have been important for people in asking whether this was Scripture or not has to do with the connection to an apostle. Certainly that was an apostle supposedly behind this, right? So a Paul or a Matthew or John or Peter. But obviously people like Mark and Luke were not apostles. Even James and Jude were not apostles either. But they certainly were. Mark connected with Peter and Paul. Luke connected with Paul. James as the brother, and James and Jude as the brothers of Jesus, the half brothers of Jesus. And so there's that connection there. And so it was this work authored by an apostle, or perhaps somebody who would have been close? Had a little bit of a technical glitch there. I think we're back. So the third criteria was that of antiquity, and so works like The Shepherd by Hermas and some others All right, so hopefully that's the last of the technical difficulties. I'm going to leave the video off since that seems to be the problem. Was it a Catholic work? Was it a universal work? Was it a work that was suitable for public reading? Was it something that was read publicly in the churches? That was another thing that many people looked at. Additionally, the question of how does it line up with the rule of faith? Does it fit with the teachings found in this summary of apostolic preaching? If it doesn't, then it's not something that should be considered to be Scripture. And so, as I mentioned, in general, you see wide agreement on certain books, but there were a few books that remained problematic. The eastern part of the Roman Empire had problems with the book of Revelation. Probably what finished that, why it ended up being accepted, is its connection with the Apostle John. The Western Church had some problems with the book of Hebrews. And so for a long time, many in the Western Church didn't believe that it had come from the pen of Paul. And so it was probably through the tradition that developed that Paul was the writer of Hebrews that led to his acceptance. However, Hebrews was quoted throughout 1 Clement, right? So it was known and accepted as a book fairly early. James is also mentioned in 1 Clement and in the Shepherd by Hermas. And we even see things like 1 Timothy 5:18 mentioning a quote of Jesus, which is found in the Gospel of Luke as Scripture. Right? The laborer is worthy of his hire. The first known list of the 27 books of the New Testament, in the order that we have them today, is what's known as the Festal Letter of Athanasius in the year 367. Right, writing at the time of Easter, it lists the current 27 books as the canon. And that is confirmed in the late 4th century by a church council. And so again, although a lot of people would point to things like this saying, well, this was a certain group of Christians imposing their will on others, no, it's kind of like by this time there is a recognition of the fullness of Scripture, the entirety of God's revelation. Any questions about canon?
Public reading and Catholicity are not quite the same thing.
No, right? So Catholicity has to do with, is it applicable to the universal church?
Okay.
Let's move from doctrine then into talking about Christian practice. One of the issues that comes up during the 4th century and into the 5th century is the question of practice itself. How is a practice, a religious practice, a Christian practice, effective? What is it that makes something useful or important? Is there something within the practice itself, or does the worthiness of the person performing the practice weigh in on whether this practice is acceptable to God or not? Now, probably most of us would say, well, what matters is, the practice itself, right? So, for example, let's take baptism. A baptism is effective based on the person being baptized, we would say, not the person who is baptizing them. And so we would say it's in the practice itself and the person that's being performed on, not the person that is performing it. When it comes to the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, communion, we would say, it doesn't matter if the person who says the prayer over the bread or the cup is right with God or not. What it depends on is me as I take it, am I in the right place with God as I take these items? Well, a lot of that has to do with being shaped by an American situation, right, in the 21st century. But back in the 4th century, and even into the 3rd century, and going backwards, there was that question of, if there is something about the person who is officiating the ceremony, And so thinking back through about those questions of the bishops who last during various persecutions, wouldn't you feel if you had been baptized by that person and they had been one of the people that kind of fallen away during persecution? Would it be possible that you might feel some questions about whether your baptism was right or not? Because, the importance of, well, here's this person who was a leader in the church and now has fallen away. Essentially, we're moving into, within the Roman church, the question of, or the development of what's known as a sacrament. And by the 4th century, this term, sacrament, is used to refer to certain Christian practices. It comes from a Latin word, sacramentum, which means an oath, and Tertullian referred to it as taking an oath of loyalty to Christ at baptism. Now, Greeks tended to use the word mystery to refer to similar types of practices, with the idea of it being a mystery was a sacred ceremony. Essentially, the idea of a sacrament was a practice that involved outward actions, but that brought inward blessings. Specifically, it will become an issue or become a development of thinking about how does God extend His grace to human beings through certain practices. Essentially, in the 4th century, there are 3 sacraments. And 3 sacraments. One major controversy in the 4th century over had turned over scriptures and other Christian books. Right? So it wasn't just a matter of they had left the faith, they had given copies of the scriptures for them to be Caleb, if this goes out one more time, we probably won't connect again, and so I'll record another video and let you connect that way. So if we lose you again, I'll get in touch with you as to how to get the information. All right, so North Africa. A man named Caecilian was ordained to the bishopric of Carthage in North Africa. Those that tended to have a stricter view of this issue didn't really like Caecilian, and pointed out that one of the bishops who had ordained Caecilian had been an individual who had fallen away. Now, it's not just an issue of theology and this individual. It appears that there were some politics involved. The bishopric of Carthage at this time was elected, not appointed. And so the people had a say in all of this. And so there were some that opposed Caecilian and probably wanted the position themselves. And so they felt that Caecilian wasn't appropriate for him to be bishop. And so they elected a rival bishop. Well, he died, and a man named Donatus is elected. Caecilian refers to himself and his followers as Catholic. They are the universal church. Donatus calls his followers the Church of the Martyrs, to suggest we are connected with the people who remain faithful, versus Caecilian's group who are connected with people who had fallen away. Constantine gets involved in the issue and essentially says the Western bishops need to make a decision. They decided to support Caecilian. And so essentially there is this question. Is something an effective practice, in this case ordination, because of the practice or the worthiness of the one who does the practice? Well, Augustine gets involved in this question, and he essentially argues that the Donatists who believe that part of the effectiveness of a practice or sacrament is based on the one officiating at the sacrament. And Augustine says you're giving too much credit to human beings, and you're ignoring how grace works in all of this. Human beings cannot make the decision between pure and impure, worthy or unworthy. The power of a practice is based on the one who instituted the practice, Jesus. Now, of course, he doesn't just allow anyone to perform a Christian practice. The church should decide who is authorized to perform certain actions. Right? The church is involved in who's going to be the priest or the bishop that performs these things, but that doesn't determine the validity of the action. And so these differences show up later on in the form of two Latin phrases, ex opere operantis, which was essentially the Donatist position. And something is effective on the basis of the one who works. The Augustinian position is ex opere operato, on the basis of the work itself. Right? So the one who works versus the work itself. And of course, this is a very important issue for a lot of people in the 4th century, because we're talking about practices that are central to the Christian faith. Baptism, the taking of the Eucharist. These are important things. And so, does it matter who is performing these things?